percents and fractions. This is actually a 6th grade topic, but I think we all needed a little bit of review on it, so we're going to go ahead and take some notes on that and just remind ourselves how to do this. So the first thing you want to do is think about how you go from decimals to fractions, from fractions to decimals, back and forth. And so sometimes I like to draw myself a table. There's lots of different ways to remember it, but sometimes I just draw this little table so that I can remind myself. And really, remember, decimals, fractions, and percents are proportional relationships, right? We're just multiplying by 100 or dividing by 100 between these. So let's remember how we get there. And remember, I tell you the very easiest one, the absolute easiest one, is to go from fraction to decimal. Because all you do is, in your calculator, you do top divided by bottom, and that's all you have to do. You don't have to change it or anything. You literally, excuse me, you just take whatever number it gives you, and that's the decimal. Okay, you just write it like that. Now, if I wanted to go from a decimal to a percent, I need to multiply by 100. Okay, and so if you want to go fraction to percent, you would just have to do both of those, right? And so instead of having a whole nother, specific way to go from fraction to percent, I just say, just do both, right? Divide the top by the bottom and then multiply by 100. Okay, now what if we wanted to go back? Well, from percent to decimal, we divide by 100, because remember, percent means out of 100 or divided by 100. And then from decimal to fraction, we say it, write it, and simplify. So let's look at some examples here. Oh, before we do that, I just wanted to remind you, we're going to put this in here. Percent means out of 100. So when you see this, when you see the percent symbol, if you see something that says 25%, that means 25 out of 100. If you see 99%, that's 99 out of 100. Okay? So let's look at some examples. First, we're going to go percent to decimal. And remember, to do that, we divide by 100, because that's what it means. If it's something percent, it means divide it by 100. So, for example, we have 32%. You could read this as 32 out of 100, or 32 divided by 100. So that's what we do. We divide it by 100. And if you want to, you can just put it in your calculator and divide it. 32 divided by 100, you're going to get 0.032. Or I'll show you the next one where we actually move the decimal when we divide by 100. So either option is fine. You can use your calculator, or you can move the decimal. So if I have 12.5%, I need to divide by 100. So I'm going to show you an example. If I have 12.5%, how do I divide by 100? Well, when I divide by 100, it actually moves all these over two place values. So it kind of moves this decimal this way, and the decimal ends up right there now. Okay, so now I write this as 0.125. So that's my decimal that represents 12.5%. And some people wonder why this 0 just spawns, right? But because there's already zeros all the way over here and zeros all the way over here place holding, because there's tens, there's hundreds, or ones and tens, but there's no hundreds. So there is a 0 here, but it was invisible. And so when we move the decimal there, we now have to make that 0 visible so that we can have that placeholder, because otherwise that decimal just gets lost. So what if I have 0.16%? Well, we can write that as, so here I have 0.16%, and let's just move the decimal, 1, 2, because we're dividing by 100, and see how I jumped over some invisible thing here? Well, remember, there are invisible zeros before and after everything, right? So there's our invisible 0. So we just need to write it now. It has to be visible. 0. And we have 2 zeros behind the decimal, 0.0016. All right, let's look at decimal to percent. Now if we divide to go back, we're going to multiply to go forward, right? So we multiply by 100 to do the opposite. So if I start out with a decimal like 0.52, I multiply that by 100, and again, you could do that in your calculator, or you can move the decimal. That's going to be 52%. Okay? What if I had something like 0.5? Well, when I multiply that by 100, remember that moves these two places, moves the place values over twice when we multiply by 100. And so that actually makes the decimal end up going this way, right? So we go 1, 2. And we jumped over this invisible thing, which is, whoop, I almost lost my marker there. There's an invisible 0 there. So this 0 can now become invisible because it's no longer needed, because we don't need that placeholder. So we can just write now 50%. Okay, what if I had 1.4? We're going to do the same thing. 1.4, and when we move the decimal two places, 1, 2, again the decimal ends up there, this 0 needs to become visible, and we have 140%. One last one, 0.035. So we write 0.035. The decimal always just moves two places. Some people want to put it at the end all the time, but that's not where it's supposed to go. It should go just two spots, so that would be 3.5%. Now let's look at fractions. Everybody loves this F word, fractions. You'd be surprised how many times I ask somebody what is 3/4 as a decimal, and they say 3.4. And I'm like, no. So we've really got to pay attention to these fractions, okay? So fraction to decimal, remember this is the easiest. All we do is top number divided by bottom number in our calculator, and that's it. So for example, if I had 2/5, all I type into my calculator is 2 divided by 5, and I get out 0.4. That's it. In younger grades, maybe you looked at making this a denominator of 10 or a denominator of 100. That's possible, but we don't need to do that for now. All you have to do is put 2 divided by 5 in your calculator. What if it's an improper fraction like 15/6? You do not need to turn this into a mixed number. You could, but it's just as easy to do in your calculator. 15 divided by 6, and when you put that in, you get 2.5. So any fraction at all can be turned into a decimal by simply taking the top number divided by the bottom number. Now last but not least, we're going to do decimal to fraction. And this one we have to say it, write it, and then simplify. So if I have a decimal like 0.51, I need to say this. Now I'm saying it 0.51 because as a high school teacher, oftentimes we use that kind of language, but think way back to middle school or elementary school. When you were asked to read this, your teacher wouldn't let you say point. She would say 0 and, we'd say 0 and 51 hundredths. Okay, so you say it out loud, and then all you have to do is write that. 0, we don't need to write the 0, and then 51 hundredths. And that's it. That's how you write it. What if you had, oh, and that one doesn't need to be simplified because it doesn't have any common factors. The only factors of 51 are 3 and 17. And so that doesn't share any factors with 100. Okay, what if I had 0.032? Okay, we're going to say it again. We can just leave out the 0 this time. So we have 32. Now this is in the tenths, hundredths, thousandths column. So we have 32 over 1,000. That's what that means. Now if we wanted to simplify this, if you know that they divide by a certain number, you can start with that number. But if I don't know, I just start with 2. So I say I divide by 2, I divide 32 by 2, and 1,000 by 2, and I get 16 over 500. Then I divide by 2 again, and I get 8 over 250. And then I divide by 2 again, and I do 4 over 125. Now 4, the factors of 4 are 2 and 2. Factors of 125 are 5, 5, and 5. So they don't share any factors, so we are fully simplified now. So depending on whether or not you're required to simplify, you'd write either one of those. Okay, now let's look at another one. What if I have a whole and a decimal, right? So this is a number with 1 in front of it. Well, we do the same thing. We're going to say it. 1 and 5 hundredths. Then I just write it. 1 and 5 hundredths. And then we're going to simplify that. That actually simplifies to 1 and 1/20th because they both divide by 5. What about like 2.008? We're going to say it. 2 and 8 thousandths because it's in the thousandths column. So 2 and 8 thousandths. And I happen to know that 1,000, because 1,000 divided by 8 happened to be 125, so I know this is 2 and 1 over 125. And one more, let's try one like this. Now sometimes people get confused because there's numbers in all of them. There's numbers in the tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. But we just say the very last, wherever it ends is the place value that we use, right? So this would be 3 and... Okay, and then we don't worry that this is in the tenths. We just say this all is one big number, so 125, and that ends in the thousandths place. So we would just write this as 3 and 125 thousandths, which happens to simplify to 3 and 1/8. And there you go.